All right, so chapter 1. And we are going to be taking a look in this chapter at these particular topics. And these are the major topics covered in chapter 1. So looking at what really defines life, looking at the 7 most common properties and processes used to define life in biology. Make sure you know those and get a good example of each so it'll help you remember. And then also looking at something called the biological hierarchy. It's really an organized way of, or a way to organize life into increasingly larger and larger groupings. And then looking at the difference between reductionism and systems biology. And also with that, a concept called emergent properties, which are these wonderful, magical type properties that emerge in systems biology, as we'll see. And finally, looking at the different types of approaches, or different approaches to science. Inquiry, which is either using something called discovery science or hypothesis-based science, and also the idea of the different types of reasoning involved with each. So we'll go on to looking at the properties and processes. So again, have an idea or an example of each of these. Order. Life is ordered, and you have this beautiful order of this center part of this beautiful sunflower, and then the petals arranged around it. Evolutionary adaptation. This is a pygmy seahorse here. Blends so beautifully into its coral background. That is a property of life. And then here we have response to the environment, this Venus flytrap, closing in on the dragonfly as it sort of is scoping out the area. So responding to the environment, another property of life. And then we have the other 4 listed here. Regulation, regulating the internal environment, this jackrabbit having its ears splayed open, being able to regulate its internal body temperature, releasing heat. Energy processing, taking in food. Here we have a hummingbird, and using that food energy or that chemical energy and changing it into different form of energy in the body to utilize to do all the activities of life. Of course, reproduction. Can it reproduce on its own? And then does it grow and develop from young to adult? So those are the 7 properties and processes. And then looking at the hierarchy, we have the hierarchy items listed here from most all-encompassing to the smallest part of the hierarchy. And I took an example here with looking at your hometown and looking at that through that kind of an example is very helpful. So, you know, the organization or the order of the items in the hierarchy, and then also have an example for each, or know what each part of the hierarchy is studying or details. And using an example like this is very helpful in remembering the different levels. All right, so idea of emergent properties, properties that emerge as a result of all the parts of a system coming together and working together. And a good example is the digestive system. It's a system of different organs that ultimately give you digestion of your food and absorbing your food. And without all of the parts, the mouth, the esophagus, stomach, intestines, etc., working together, you would not have this property that emerges. So systems biology, it's really the goal of science these days, but it is very difficult because there are so many interacting parts. And systems biology, the goal here is to understand how all parts interact, and that is a very tall order. Just looking here at this one cell in a tiny organism called a Drosophila, a fruit fly, we see the nucleus, and then we have the cytoplasm, and then the plasma membrane of this cell. Each of these circles represents a different type of protein, and the colors are shown. And these lines connecting these circles represent the interactions among these proteins. So we can see just by this one small example that this idea of systems biology is very complex, but it is something we are working toward. Now, the opposite of systems biology would be something called reductionism. You're reducing the system down to its single parts or components. And a good example of that would be actually the Human Genome Project. Just looking for the structure of the DNA. We weren't looking for how DNA interacts with other molecules in the cell and anything of that type. We were really just looking for one part of this genetics puzzle, which was the order of the nucleotides in the human genome. So this last part here, discovery science and hypothesis-based science, two approaches to scientific research. The first is really just describing what you're seeing in the world. You're not trying to solve any kind of problems or explain anything, you're really just describing. So Jane Goodall was a good discovery scientist as she described the chimpanzees in the wild and their behaviors. And this type of reasoning used here is called induction or inductive reasoning, where you take specific observations over a long period of time and you can make a generalization. The sun comes up every day in the east, and you see that every single day. So you make a generalization, the sun rises in the east. Okay, so that's just one small example of discovery science and this idea of inductive reasoning. And then hypothesis-based science, you're explaining something, you're trying to find a conclusion, or come to a conclusion, so you're using deductive reasoning. So you're taking those generalizations from discovery science, utilizing them here, and you're asking why. Why does that happen? And you're coming to specific conclusions. So hypothesis-based science, you'll be responsible for the 6 steps. And in the PowerPoint, there is an example of a cholesterol-reducing drug trial. And in that, it goes through each of the steps, and it gives you the observation, the question, hypothesis, etc. So take a look at that as an example for yourself of this hypothesis-based science. And I hope that this has helped you better understand this particular chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know.